But we're so glad to be kicking off another year. Let's just take a second. Anybody, I'm sure there are some, this is your first semester as a PhD student. Just raise your hand. All right. Could you guys introduce yourselves? We'll start with Father.
Hi everyone, my name is Alder Foster. I'm a PhD student in New Testament, studying with Dr. Schreiner. I'm from Texas, as you can hear.
Yes.
Via South Africa.
Yeah, I'm Garrett Craig. I'm PhD New Testament. Dr.
Old Testament. My name is Scott McQuinn. Studying with Dr. Gentry.
Great. Welcome, Scott.
Yeah, two in the background there.
My name is David Joe from South Korea and Christian philosophy on the Catholic faith.
Yeah, my name is Junior Park. I'm from South Korea, and the Old Testament speech straight and there's a care.
Okay. Welcome. Anybody else we missed? We have several professors here. Thank you for joining us today, including, I don't know if you've met Dr. Aiken, new Dean of the Billy Graham School. If you haven't met him yet, make sure you say hello to some other professors here. So anyways, great. So great to be here. We have bookmarks that didn't quite come back from the printer by today. Sorry about that, but that will lay out who's coming each week over the course of the semester. Some great guests coming next week. I think it's Greg Ellison, who said, and then just a great lineup all semester. So we hope to see you each week. But today we have my good friend, Dr. Dru Johnson. He teaches at the King's College in New York City. He's been there 9 years, is that right? And he is an ordained minister in the Evangelical Presbyterian Church and does a whole bunch of other stuff too, including the OnScript podcast. He's one of the founding editors, or what do you call yourselves? Co-hosts. Co-hosts, all right, of OnScript. If you have not tapped into OnScript, you really should. They have some great interviews with a wide range of people. It's really great. And did a PhD in a little place called St. Andrews, you may have heard of, and has also gone back there a couple times on fellowships with the Analytic and Exegetical Theology group. But part of the reason he's here this week is because he is now the co-founder or the founder and executive director of a new Center for Hebraic Thought, which is funded through, I think, originally through a Jewish organization, is that right? But it's really international, and it's geared towards helping Christians in particular,
Yes.
you can talk about, helping Christians in particular understand the world of the Hebrew Bible and its place in intellectual history. I just made that up. Is that true?
That's mostly true.
Okay.
Hebrew Bible and the New Testament.
Okay.
Yes.
And so we invited him to come here, and that's what the lectures. He spoke to the Boyce Honors College last night, which was great, and then today with us, he'll be in Old Testament colloquium today as well, and then tomorrow's lecture. So all of you, I think probably at this point, if you've been in the program, I mean, I've been leading the program for 7 years, so all of you, I think, have had me for FTS, and we probably read his book, Scriptures Knowing. Is that the one we're reading? Yeah, is that, wait, Biblical Knowing or Scriptures Knowing? Yeah, Scriptures Knowing, that was yeah. But which we've all, I remember, had good conversations about that. But he's written several other books related to epistemology and ritual as well. The book Human Rights, we just talked about, we recorded an episode of Course Coffee Theology yesterday, and we talked about that book, and that's a great, very accessible book that you can really give to somebody to read. Unlike the rest of most of the things we write. So it's very good. So anyways, we are thrilled to have him here, and let's welcome him.
I'm just going to start a timer. It's 5 minutes. Got it. So that's about all we have to say about this topic. So don't open, I don't know if any of you got the handout, but don't open it. It's supposed to be a slideshow where I was going to reveal Vanna White style things that you didn't know. So you can just leave that to the side, and maybe afterward you can make a hat, a plane, or a pterodactyl with it. Some people get the reference. Yeah, so I want to talk about, I started the Center for Hebraic Thought. It's part of an extension of work that I do with this guy named Yoram Kondoni in Jerusalem. I work for his institute. That's mainly been for Jewish scholars. We'll bring in Christian scholars, but it's mainly been oriented towards Jews, Jewish scholarship, and the synagogue. And so I love doing that work, but all the things we're doing there there I thought were so important that the church needs to know those. So that's part of the emphasis. You'll hear part of that. I think if you're a biblical person, so I primarily teach Hebrew Bible. That's my #1 job at my school. Is I teach Hebrew Bible to people who can't read Hebrew, and I teach hermeneutics. So I'm mostly in the world of biblical interpretation, theological interpretation. That's where I spend 90% of my time. Biblical people can tend to hear the words I'm getting ready to use and flip their brain off and they go, "Ah, it's philosophy." Like when I'm at SBL, all my biblical people go like, "Oh, Drew, he's a philosopher." And all my theology, philosophy people are like, "He's a Bible guy," right? I'm neither chocolate nor peanut butter accidentally dipped in the other one because that would taste good. But so we're working on the periphery, and in some ways, at some point, you're going to realize that everything I'm talking about is just biblical theology. It is quite literally just biblical theology. So maybe you can put that in the back, and we'll start plowing through here. But I want to talk to you guys. I thought, okay, I have a bunch of PhD students. I have this book that I've written that hasn't come out yet, but it's still in the where I can change things for them, right? So I'm using you to help me figure out if I need to change anything or if I need to add something. So thank you for your service. Okay, so I want to talk about philosophy in general. Then I'm going to talk about the Hellenistic style of philosophy, and then I'm going to kind of outline very quickly what I think is a Hebraic style of philosophy that can be found in the Torah, extends into the history of the prophets and poetic literature, and persist into the New Testament. And then I want to just, but I'm going to sketch that very quickly, raise lots of questions in your mind, and then I'll turn it over to you and figure out which questions are the most important, and we can work through them and see if I have any decent answers. Also, there is, on that table back over there, I encourage you to go to our website. I have an essay that we wrote. It's for our launch. Someone said we have to put an essay in people's hands. So there's an essay, kind of a basic case for Hebraic philosophy, thinking about the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament as philosophical in nature. Feel free to take one. And there's also a link to our website where we have podcasts, we have videos, interviews, essays on there. Okay, enough pitching. Let's get to philosophy. So how do we define philosophy? If you're undergrads, we play a game where I have you define philosophy. But I'll shortcut the game and just say there is no definition of philosophy, right? It's kind of like ask 2 rabbis, get 3 opinions. Ask a philosopher what philosophy is, and they will all give you a different definition. I thought this was true, and then it turns out there's this podcast called Philosophy Bites where they actually ask this question to a bunch of professional philosophers, and they just play back to back their definition of philosophy, and none of them are compatible with each other, right? They all think they're doing something different, right? So we don't need to bother ourselves with pretending like there is some patent, obvious, and established view of what philosophy is, and then we're going to try and describe everything in light of it. So I'll use the word philosophy, and I'll use it in this particular way in a second I'll define. But what I really mean when I say philosophy is that, first of all, that you're advocating a way to think about second-order notions. And so second-order notions are abstract notions. So you're thinking about not just this table, but what makes a table a table? Apart from any table that I've ever met, what makes a table a table? So anytime you're abstract, and so maybe I should qualify this a little bit more. So who here is Old Testament? They still call it Old Testament around here? Okay. So you had to do a little bit of ancient Near Eastern stuff, right? And if you think about like the literature of Mesopotamia, the literature of Egypt, which I'll be talking about this in Professor Dr. Hernandez's class. We'll be talking about the Mesopotamian literature and what has to do with this. But and you just think of like omenology or the lexical texts of Mesopotamia or the burial inscriptions in Egypt. You're trying to figure out, do they think about the world apart from the world they've experienced? Do they actually think about thinking? Do they think about what it means to think? Is it right to think? Can you have coherent thoughts about things that you haven't experienced? Can you project your thinking? All these kinds of questions. And as you survey these literatures, and I'm going to throw the Hebrew literature in there, you'll find, I had to come up with 3 buckets to put all this literature in, kind of categorize it. And so these are the buckets I came up with. If you can think of better bucket names, give them to me, but these are the ones I have. So the first one is scholarly. So this is where you read a collection of texts. there's clearly some rigor, some systematicity, some logic being employed regularly and coherently throughout that text. So I think of omenology texts in Mesopotamia. Very rigorous, very logical. They always follow modus ponens and modus tollens, even when it does them no good. But they're very rigorous and logical, but it's hard to tell whether there's any abstract thinking going on there. In Dr. Hernandez's class, I'll talk about some people who are making the case for abstract thinking in these texts. But it's difficult to figure out whether they're thinking about things, whether they're thinking about like, you know, the nature of a cat apart from the cat that will curse you if it walks in front of you with the right door height or whatever the omen is, right? But there's clearly something rigorous going on there. So I'll call those scholarly traditions. And then I would like to set up another bucket that I would say speculative traditions. This is where it's really clear that they are thinking about something besides this cup when they think about cups. What's the nature of a cup? When does something become a cup? My hand is cupped, but it's not a cup. And they're making those kind of moves and thinking about the difference between instance and the abstract notion. And so in Egypt, you definitely get some hints of this here and there. Different people, Jan Assmann has made an entire career out of trying to make these distinctions. And by the way, it is just funny to me that the two main Egyptologists out there today are named Assmann and Amos. So let's just get that on the table right now. So it's systematic, it's logical, it's rigorous, and they seem to be making these moves about some speculating about the nature of the world as such. But I want to separate the scholarly literature traditions from the speculative literature traditions from the philosophical literature traditions. And I'm arbitrarily using the word philosophical here. And here would be the difference. Is it's not only are they doing abstract reasoning in some way, and we can tell, it's obvious to anybody who's reading these texts, but they're also advocating a particular way to do abstract reasoning. So if you think about Socrates or Plato, maybe less so Aristotle, they're not just reasoning abstract. Of course, they're reasoning very abstractly. They're getting into nowhere land where you don't even know what they're talking about, right? So you're not sure the ontological status of some of the things they're talking about. But they're saying, and here is the way you should think about these things, right? And here's the processes you should put your body through in order to understand this abstract notion correctly. That's philosophical. So scholarly, speculative, philosophical. So those are the three categories I'm going to kind of use as I go forward. Okay, so then the question is, let's see. Well, let me tell you a story, because everybody loves stories. So 15 years ago or so, I was doing work in epistemology and scripture, and I was presenting at philosophy conferences, Christian philosophy conferences and philosophy of religion that aren't necessarily Christian, some of them aren't, some of them aren't. And I would run into philosophers of religion or Christian philosophers who I'd say, oh, I work in the epistemology of scripture itself. They'd be like, Alvin Flanagan? No, like the actual epistemology in scripture, right? And no lie, most of them would say, there is no epistemology. Scripture doesn't care about knowledge, theories of knowledge. I go, well, there are some texts about knowledge in there, like Genesis 3, knowledge of good and evil. It's the prime account that starts everything for humanity. But that was the basic sentiment that I got back, right? And then when I pushed back, and they said, well, but that's a story. Like, that's just narratives, right? I mean, these were professional philosophers telling me that a narrative was not philosophical. And so the irony of that for me was I did an MDiv, started working as a pastor, and then I took a master's in analytic philosophy, which if you don't know what that is, you're safe. If you do, then welcome to my world. But it was the first time I'd ever studied philosophy. This is the way you study philosophy. Never study any philosophy for 32 years of your life, and then to do a master's in it, where you just drop in the deep end. That was really fun, right? So I started reading the Socratic dialogue and Plato and Aristotle. But I started with Socrates, and what am I reading? I'm reading a story of this crotchety old man, the troubler of Athens, who just wanders around and picks fights with people. And he picks very specific fights. So if you know Socrates or the Socratic dialogue, you know that it's unclear what Socrates actually thinks philosophically. It's unclear what his particular metaphysics or maybe his epistemology is a little more clear. all he does is he argues with people who think they know something, and he just wrestles them down to the point where they realize they don't know what they thought they knew, or they're relying on fallible premises or authorities that they were making appeals to authority. They had all kinds of problems. So he just leaves people dizzied in the problem that they don't know what they thought they knew so sure before they met this guy, right? And my philosopher friends are telling me that's philosophy. Like, it's not only philosophy, it's like philosophy. It is the beginning of philosophy for them. A story about a guy who's going around troubling people. I said, okay, fine. Because when I was reading Socrates, at some point it clicks in, I'm not just reading a story about a crotchety old guy going around asking silly questions of people. That would not be an interesting story. At some point when you're reading the Socratic dialogues, it flips over. It's almost like the fourth wall gets shattered. And you realize that Socrates isn't arguing with that guy. Plato is using the character of Socrates to argue with me. He's trying to get me to think about the nature of justice. He's trying to get me to think about the nature of the good. Well, he's less interested in the good, but justice, definitely. He's trying to get me to think, the reader, to think about the nature of the polis and political philosophy. And so here in, the quintessential philosophical text of the Western world is a narrative that contains embedded dialogues that every philosopher I know points to and says, now there's a good example of philosophy. And I say, oh, well, I have some other narratives that I think are doing something very similar. They're actually not just telling you stories, they're actually arguing with you about the nature of reality and how you see it, what you think is true, and what might not be true depending on where you come from. So that's kind of the premise I come to the whole task with. And then the question becomes, well, how do you, if there is, let's just put the question on the table. Is there a philosophical tradition in the Hebrew Bible? We'll stop at the Hebrew Bible for today. That maybe is pervasive beyond the Hebrew Bible. And then the next question is, well, how would you answer such a question, right? Well, you have to say, well, clearly they are not arguing like Socrates necessarily, although Socrates is, well, I'll leave that to the side. But they're not talking like Plato. They're not exploring the issue like Plato, and definitely not like Aristotle. But is there a way in which they talk about these issues that is just as rigorous, sound, scholarly, speculative? And then that other question, are they advocating a way to understand this thing? Right? Are they telling you there is a particular thing you need to do with your body, which is what Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all believe. There's something you need to do with your body in order to understand these things in the world, right? To reorder your soul in the right way. I've never used this before for presenting anything, so if I stare at it for a long time, just hit me on the back of the head. Okay, so thinking about Hellenistic philosophy, we asked the question, I'm going to put Hellenistic philosophy in conversation with what I'm going to call Hebraic philosophical style. So what are the genetic markers of Hellenistic or Hellenism, philosophy that comes out of the Greek tradition? And by that I mean, just start by asking the question, if a student was telling me about something they read, right, and they couldn't remember exactly what it was, but they're just describing to me, oh, I read some philosophy, and they couldn't remember any of the names or the context or what century it was in, but they're just telling you these ideas. At some point, if they talk long enough, you should be able to figure out, like, oh, that's Kant, right? You know Kant's work. Actually, you can probably figure out it's Kant pretty quickly. Well, I don't know what that is, but that's got to be a Greek philosophy, right? They were talking about the forms, and they believed everything real and good and permanent and unchangeable was up in the heavens, and everything down here was deceptive and problematic. Okay, that's Hellenistic, right? That's the content. But I think there's a stylistic issue here. So let me just give you what I consider to be the 6 genetic markers of my caricature of the Greek philosophical tradition. Is that enough caveats to get myself off the hook here? Okay. I've had some classicists read this and they say, yeah, okay, this basically works, but if you find flaws, please call me out on them. So here's the 6. If there are 2 modes of argument and then 4 convictions. And I'm gonna at some point read a little bit here just to make sure I'm saying the right things, but not yet. Okay, the first mode is that arguments tend to be linear. By linear, I mean they are traceable arguments that you can think deductive here is often a form of argument. You work from premise A to premise B to premise C to some kind of conclusion. They're coordinated and subcoordinated in some but that if you lay out the argument, I should be able to trace from the conclusion back to all the premises and see how they work together in some way. That is, obviously, this is a caricature, so it's going to fall short on. I can already think of several examples where it's not going to quite fit, but this is to capture the whole project. They're traceable in form, and they're distinctively deductive by linear, that's what I mean, but they're also autonomous. So arguments are autonomous in the sense that the argument in and of itself rises and falls on the efficacy of the argument. It's not dependent on some story about creation. It's not dependent on some archfather. Sometimes they are dependent, like Aristotle and Plato, and definitely Socrates, are often caught with their pants down, as it were, saying, oh, actually, I don't know how I know this, except for that the oracles of the divines must have told me this, right? So even your arch Greek philosophers who are supposedly pure reasonists, right? They are often, not often, sometimes appealing to direct divine revelation, right? as explaining where they're getting these ideas from. But for the most part, their arguments are going to be autonomous. They're going to stand and fall on their own, right? Like a syllogism, right? All cats are misanthropes. Hold on, I should be able to do this. Did I mess up the all cats are Socrates? All men are mortal. Socrates is man. Therefore, all men are mortal. Socrates is man. How does this work?
Socrates is mortal.
Nobody's playing my game. You are not undergrads, I can tell. Yes, Socrates is a cat. Traceable and autonomous, right? If you want to think about a syllogism as a character. Okay. We actually, did everybody follow? All men are mortal. Socrates is man. Of course, Socrates is mortal. Make sure we get the real one out there on the table. And then I also want to say something about, like, let's be honest, because those are the two modes. That they're linear and autonomous in general. They favor that style of philosophizing. And if you want to put it in conversation with a later tradition like Nietzsche, anybody know how Nietzsche describes his philosophizing? With a sledgehammer, right? Philosophizing with a sledgehammer, right? So he's not doing linear autonomous arguments. And if you've read Nietzsche, you would definitely pick that up, right? So then there are these convictions, and these are the kind of things that you just need to be convinced of in order to do this kind of philosophy. And let me just say something about convictions, because I think when I say the word convictions, the rationalist part of us that's been imbued in us as Westerners is going to say, like, well, do convictions really count in philosophy? And here's what I would say: Hellenism's philosophical style carries a set of philosophical convictions, and the term conviction may sound like I have left the world of philosophy and entered some moralistic sphere. However, even in the most cutting analytic endeavors, Gary Gutting has shown that deductively linear arguments do not decide the favorable reception of philosophical ideas, even amongst analytic philosophers, even today. In fact, some of the very popular critiques do not even contain a deductively sound argument. Even if they are in, you notice I'm using a lot of evens here, even if they are in this linear style. He cites the favorable reception of Quine, W.B.O. Quine's Two Dogmas of Empiricism. Two Dogmas of Empiricism is like boilerplate analytic philosophy today. Everybody thinks that this is a cardinal work in analytic philosophy. And here's what Gary Gutting says about that, who is also an analytic philosopher. Quote, even more than the critique of the second dogma, the final statement of Quine's holistic vision of knowledge and reality is strikingly unargued. Quine's holism seems supported by nothing more than persuasive rhetoric. His presentation is impressive as a philosophical manifest or a program, but not as a cogent argument for a conclusion. So I just want to say, when we come to the issue of philosophical convictions, Gary Gutting's book, by the way, it's What Philosophers Know. It's a fantastic book. Well, if you don't like analytic philosophy, don't read it. But it's a series of case studies of kind of the turning points in analytic philosophy, these big cases like Quine's Two Dogmas of Empiricism. And every single one he goes through, and he says, there's no argument here. There's nothing being argued. He won people over to this new view, and they bought it. And they're often based on intuitions and convictions. Okay, so here are the convictions, without further ado. For Hellenist style, they tend to have a domestic, I named these, so sorry in advance. They tend to have a domesticationist bent. And by that I mean, the goal is to wrangle the concrete into the abstract where you can have control, right? And so Epictetus has a famous saying, he's a Stoic philosopher, quote, "Philosophy does not claim to secure for us anything outside of our control. Otherwise, it would be taking on matters that do not concern it." So there is this kind of power and control mechanism going on in this style of philosophy. Second, I'm just going to run through these quickly. They tend to have an abstractionist conviction, which means the goal is to get us quickly away from the individual cup into the cupness of cups as quickly as possible, right? So the goal is to abstract away from reality. And of course, there is a particular metaphysic of Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy that believes the reason you abstract is because that's where the real stuff is, right? All this stuff, this cup is a problem for us. Third, the psychology of Hellenism's philosophical style proposes a strong mentalist model of understanding. And by that now, if any of you have ever studied any of the schools of philosophy of Athens or Roman philosophy, you'll know that they're very worried about the body, what you're doing with your body, right? So it's not like they don't care about the body, but what you're doing with your body, the ultimate goal is that it affects your soul and gets you to your soul to tranquility, so equilibrium, you want to put it that way. But the way you do it is through mentalist regimes. So even though I might look at what they're doing, I go, oh no, you're totally like ritualistic in the way you approach understanding the universe. They would say, yeah, but the rituals are just to get your soul in correct order. And obviously, if you've read Augustine, he picks up on this quite a bit. So it's mentalist. So what do we have? Domesticationist, abstractionist, mentalist. I'm sorry for these terms. I don't know what else to call them. And then fourth, and this is a big one. In fact, it might be the most striking one, the classist. So, and this is not just of Greece and Rome. You can actually pick any intellectual tradition in the ancient world, and they all have sages. There are the elites who understand these things, who train in them and understand, and then there's everybody else. And usually in the everybody else category, the first category of everybody else is women, right? They get cut out as, you know, Aristotle's dictum, a fetus is a woman gone awry, or sorry, a woman is a fetus gone awry. That doesn't make any sense, right? So this idea that if everything goes right in the womb, it becomes a man. If the woman gets kicked or is sick during pregnancy, it becomes a woman. So even in her ontology, the woman is already like mentally incapable of doing the kind of stuff the sages do. Plato recovers women a little bit, but then they go right back down the drain in the rest of the tradition. I mean, if you just want to very quickly flip over to the Hebrew Bible and think about the wisdom traditions, the training traditions of the Hebrew Bible, it is for everybody. And you get the same sentiment in the politic, right? The king is not some deistically installed high ruler. He's an everyman. He's one of us. Okay. Then I say some things about this being a caricature. I think I can leave that. I'm going to stop here for questions before I move on. Am I at a point where I've drummed up questions, or you're still like waiting to see whether you're going to buy any of this joke? Questions of clarification. I just said something that just flat out did not make sense. Yeah.
Can you just repeat the fourth conviction that you stated?
It was actually I don't know. Oh, it was mentalist. No, I said classicist. Classist. And I worked over these terms so many times, but I'm sure one of you has a brilliant, simple word that will replace any of these. I know he looks like he's already got a couple in mind. So wait until we get to the Hebrew one. It gets worse. There's problems everywhere. That's okay. Terms are fine. Now, if you want to flip here to this, right? So actually, don't flip. Just let me tell you. Okay, think about the 5 big powerhouse culture civilizations in the ancient world that we're generally concerned with from the Bronze and Iron Age. So we're talking about Egypt. Well, Egypt's down here for you all. Mesopotamia, and then your Aegean and Mediterranean traditions. Greece, and then later Rome, the Empire of Rome, and then the Hebrew Bible and the Israelites who produced the Hebrew Bible, right? Okay, Now, if you were just a group, let's think of those five, think of the intellectual tradition. So all of you know something about, you've read some literature at some point in your studies for each one of those traditions. Maybe it's just the Code of Hammurabi, maybe it's just a funerary text or a lament song from Egypt or something. But hopefully you've read something, right? But if you think about how they think of the world, how they conceptualize the world, right? How would you group those five? If you were to say, okay, we're going to split them into a couple of affinity groups. What, one of these kids is not like the other, or how would they clump together? If you would take those five, where would you put them? Anybody want to suggest some clumpings?
Greece and Rome on the one hand, and
Yep.
the other three on the other.
Yeah, so Greece and Rome, does that sound okay? Maybe if you're really dogmatically fundamentalist like me, you might want to separate Israel out entirely and say, screw these guys, they can do their own thing, but we're doing something else over here. Yeah, so I was shocked. I had no idea. I started hanging out with ancient Near Eastern scholars a few years ago, and they were just a weird group of people. They really are weird in many ways, but you learn so many things. I did not know, and just forgive me if you're like, of course, Drew, like everybody knows this, right? But I had no idea that almost 100 years ago, you had this group of what they called, unfortunately, Orientalists, these ancient Near Eastern scholars from the University of Chicago. You've heard of it. They have a pretty big institute there where they study these things. In the 1930s and 40s, you have this group of scholars that gets together and they say, let's talk about, the height of positivisms of all sorts. Let's talk about the intellectual world of these ancient cultures that we study. Let's talk about Greece, Rome, Israel, and this is how they clump it. Greece, Rome, Israel, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. And for all of these, now all of these guys, and there's a few women involved as well in this project, but for them, you got to remember, these are 1940s Orientalists from the University of Chicago. So they all read Sumerian, Akkadian, Ugaritic, probably some other ones that I don't know, Canaanite, Hebrew, Egyptian, all of the several languages of Egyptian, and Greek and Hebrew. So they've read all of these texts in their training. They're old school, like where they didn't have the internet and they just studied all of this stuff. So it's not like they're unaware of these literary traditions. And when they look at these five culture/civilization/empires and the literary traditions that were produced by these groups, they think it is uncontroversial that the Hebrew Bible belongs to Greece and Rome intellectually. They think it's like leaps and bounds above anything going on in Mesopotamia. And if you've studied anything going on in Mesopotamia, those are no dummies over there, right? Intellectual prowess in Mesopotamia is off the hook. But the ability to conceptualize their world, there's a serious question as to how they conceptualize the world and if it was realistic in any kind of way that scientifically would help. Mathematically, the Sumerians are doing sesmagesimal calculus, base 60 calculus. They're not dumb. Sumerians had the number 0 in their math, which we lost for a couple thousand years. We just regained recently, which helped us tremendously in our engineering and calculating powers, right? But these guys and gals looking at across this literature, they said, no, it's clear. In fact, maybe I have, oh yeah. Henri Frankfurt, Torkild Jakobsen, you might have heard of some of these people. William Irwin, maybe not have heard of him. But this is the summary statement these are summary statements that are coming out after they've surveyed Egypt, Greece, Rome, and Mesopotamia, and the Israelite tradition and the Hebrew Bible. This is the last statement. Israel was without peer in the power and scope of their critical intellectualism. This is Henri Frankfurt from the University of Chicago. Now, most biblical scholars, when I say that to them, they're like, what? I don't know, Peter, if you run into how common people know this. Have you heard of the Intellectual Adventures of Ancient Man?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So A&E people know this. Like, it's just, yeah, of course. Old Testament scholars, I find half of them never heard of it in their life. They're surprised by this. Other half are like, oh yeah, I had to read that in grade school. So figuring out how much of this I want to read. So I guess this struck me. I read this ancient. It was called Beyond Philosophy originally, and then they added a chapter on Israelite literary tradition and called it The Intellectual Adventure of Ancient Man. I don't know if the whole thing, unless you're really interested in it, is worth reading, but the summary chapter is definitely worth your time reading because they pull it all together. Anybody want to guess what they think is the thing that determines whether civilization is going to kind of rise into what they call critical intellectualism, or be mired down and kind of like just dealing with this table, this phone, that's a bad example, issues. What allows them to enter this realm of abstraction where they can do all of this kind of sophisticated conceptualization? Yes. Can you say more? Oh no, not the ability to write, because obviously, I mean, if you know what's going on in Mesopotamia, their writing skills are off the hook. Like they're working from logographic to syllabic and alphabetic languages simultaneously. It's insane, actually. Their ability to write. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's whether they're mired in myth or not, whether they get released from myth. And for now these are 1940s University of Chicago people, so they're progressivists and evolutionists. And I mean, evolutionists not in the Darwin sense, but there's something better being distilled through the power of progress. Yeah, so they're going to say Mesopotamians and Egyptians didn't have a prayer. They just didn't have the conceptual goods to get out of their myth. They're permanently trapped in them, instantiated for particular reasons, and material culture as well. Hebrews somehow, Jan Osman is going to say it's through monotheism. And William Irwin says it's through monotheism, that conceptual shift allows them to almost completely escape this mythic binding that holds them down conceptually, and gives them the goods to do most of what you see. And I'd say this is it's a great book, great insights. They don't go far enough, but I don't think that's their fault at all. So what's going on in the Hebrew Bible? This piqued my interest, and I thought, okay, we got to figure out what they're seeing and maybe put some description to what they're seeing, because they don't describe exactly what they think is going on or why it's so great. They try, but they keep getting stuck in this progressivist narrative. So let me give you what I consider to be the 6 genetic markers of, actually it's, what time am I supposed to? Oh, perfect. Okay. So I have these genetic markers. Actually, if you go to the very back, I put them right next to each other. And there's recently been a book by a guy named Mark Vandermeer, who's at Columbia University. He wrote a book called Philosophy Before the Greeks, where he argues that the Mesopotamian tradition has a philosophical tradition. I don't think he successfully argues, but it's a really interesting book nonetheless. But he did give me this first one. So if we're in the Hebraic column, we're still in 2 modes of argument, and then thinking about the kind of convictions, and then we can compare it to the caricature of Hellenism. And it's a caricature of the Hebraic literature as well. So pointillist, that's not pointillist. Yeah, that is spelled correctly. Pointillist, and I'm borrowing this from Mark Vandermeer, this Assyriologist, and he says, Mary Douglas has a kind of similar discussion in her instrumental rational reasoning versus presentational reasoning. Elizabeth Sanger as well has a this. Funny enough, British women in the early 20th century were like way on top of this whole discussion. I don't know why nobody else followed in suit, but they got neglected a little bit. Okay, so pointillist, what does it mean? Think of a pointillist painting. We all know pointillist paintings, like, I should really memorize Seurat. Yeah. The Saturday afternoon at the park, or I forget what it's called. But if you go in close on a pointillist painting, look at 3, 4 points, it's impossible to tell how they're related to each other or what they're trying to argue for, or what they're trying to do, right? The points only make sense in context and by kind of backing up and seeing the thread that ties them together, right? So when there's an argument in the Hebrew Bible, think about an argument about whether you can be atoned for your sin. That begins in the Hebrew Bible and gets picked up a little bit again, as you might know, in the New Testament. But that's an abstract notion, right? Atonement relies on a particular abstract notion of metaphysics, like what is sin? Is it a sticky substance that sticks to you? Is it an orientation? Is it an orientation of your body or is it an orientation of soul, right? These are all metaphysical discussions. But the way the biblical authors portray it, they portray it more in these pointillistic. I'm going to give you a bunch of stories where you should be savvy enough to kind of pick up what they're laying down and pull the thread, create the thread that's going to pull between these to tie them all together. If you want to think about some really baseline instances, think about the world of ethics. Is it okay to prostitute your wife? Seems like a good question to ask, especially in premarital counseling. You want to know that, like, or is it okay to prostitute your husband? Because actually both cases are in Genesis, right? So you're reading through Genesis. These are the patriarchs of the faith, celebrating the New Testament, pimping out their wife. And then you just keep reading, you're like, oh, Rachel pimps out her husband. And he gets this his other wife, his co-wife, pregnant. And anybody remember they name him Issachar? Anybody know what Issachar translates into? Roughly.
I will be remembered.
No, that would be Zakah. Yeah, it's a whore's wages is how it's translated. Yeah. So names really mean something in the Hebrew Bible. That's what they keep saying at my church. Yeah. So if you're asking this question, just a basic ethical question, what's the nature of marriage? What are the boundaries of marriage? What are the kinds of things that keep a marriage within boundaries? Metaphysically, what holds it together over time? And are things, particular concrete instances like prostituting out one of your spouses, is that okay or not? But what if you're afraid that you're going to get killed? Can then you say, here, have my wife sexually? What if you're afraid your genetic line's going to get cut off? Can you say, here, have my husband sexually, right? Those real questions, real people, real problems, right? And if you read Genesis, you know that it never solves this question at all for you. And then you get into Exodus, doesn't solve it. Stop me when we get there. Leviticus, Numbers, like where do they settle this question? Actually, in Leviticus 18, you do get some hints. You know, like Leviticus 18, all the people you can't have sex with. It's like, and you can't take a sister and a wife and her sister as a rival. And they don't say it, but you know they're like, we're looking at you, Jacob. But notice the intellectual sophistication of that kind of argumentation. That they assume that you are paying attention, that they're raising all kinds of things that should make you pay attention even closer. You go, wait, what? Can we do this? Can you get your dad drunk and have sex with them if you think the world is going to end if you don't? Lot's daughter said yes and didn't. Right? You can imagine my students are like, they have no idea this stuff is in there. It's like walking through a minefield where I know where all the mines are, and I just casually walk through and I just let them step on. Body parts are flying everywhere. Daily devotionals are flying everywhere. So yeah, so this is so that's what I mean by pointillist, is that there is a style of presentational arguing where maybe one single point never makes the case. And this is the second point that ties it together, is that it's contextualist, that every point of information or every emphasis in this grand argument that's being made, often across multiple texts, is always contextually related to something else. Like there are no freestanding arguments. Right? It always has in mind this other thing they've told you. That's the very nature of a pointillist painting. No dot stands on its own merits. No matter how pretty of a blue it is, it's not the argument. It's not what's being presented. Those are the two modes, two main modes. You can talk about some other ones in how poetry, law, and narrative work together to accomplish this. That would be a longer conversation. Then the four convictions would be Mysterianist. So opposite thing, you can start lining these up. Domesticationist is total control in the abstract realm of the idea, so that you can know it. Mysterianist is like, you can get a grip on this thing, but you're never going to absolutely understand it, right? You don't, like, you can know the cup. I can understand the cup, but I never get to see the backside. This is where Kant is actually helpful. Did I say that? Kant is actually helpful. The noumenal and the phenomenal, right? I only get access to this side of the cup. I have to trust you guys to tell me what's on the backside, and together we might be able to understand. But none of us has full, comprehensive, exhaustive knowledge of anything. Thank goodness. Apparently we're created to do that. So that's Mysterianist, that there's always this bent behind everything that, and think of Ecclesiastes as the philosopher par excellence of this topic, that you're just not going to get it, right? What's the line in Ecclesiastes 8? You know, even a man claims to know, but he doesn't know. A wise man claims to know, he doesn't really know. There's an agnosticism there, a healthy agnosticism. Then historicist is, and this is, I don't know how, if there is another term, this is the one that bothers me the most, but all I mean by this, creationist would have been the other term. That's a loaded term for a lot of people. But it just means that everything I'm telling you always has what I'm saying in reference, that there was a God who created the universe. He made these people, he covenanted with this man to make them into a nation that was going to bless the other nations. And here's how it all went wrong in all these various ways. And we are connected to that story. And it's not just a story, it's a metaphysical and a physical reality. Right? So that's what I mean by historicist, is that everything is always in coordination to that. And then as you move along in that story, it also, you see it starts getting coordinated into the future story. That's going along to that story as well. Ritualist, opposite of, on the other side of the continuum from mentalist. And by that I just mean, if there's something to be known, there is some kind of embodied ritual that a community or a person, a prophet can prescribe. And by embodying that ritual, you come to know the thing that you could not have known without doing the ritual. So think of reading x-rays or any kind of technical understanding of anything. Right? There's only one way to learn how to read an x-ray. You can read every book you want. You can watch every YouTube video you want, but until you have an authority over your shoulder, my doctor friends have told me, how do you learn how to spot very subtle, well, if you've read scriptures, no, and I talked about this, a collapsed lung, that was where it came to me. How do you spot a collapsed lung? Hundreds of x-rays with someone over your shoulder saying, pay attention to this, ignore all that, right? It's how we do it all the time, right? Ignore all that stuff, pay attention to this. That's the ritualist dimension of philosophizing. It's never a mental enterprise. And then trans-demographic, which is the sagacious problem, right? That there are elites, there are scribes, there are the ones who actually have access to this in most of the wisdom traditions of the ancient world. And the Hebrew Bible comes out and says, no, any woman who runs a farmstead, she's just as wise as any Israelite. You know, Proverbs 31, I always tell people I'm a Proverbs 31 woman. Because when you read that text, right, it's like, wait, this isn't describing a wife. Because I always ask my students, what's her husband doing? Like, really, it's an acrostic poem, which should tip you off that it's not rules to follow. It's not like a lifestyle you should set up after yourself, right? But because I have young ladies who come into my school who have been taught, you're supposed to be this kind of person. And I'm like, no, you should not stay up all night mending and sewing and buying property the next day and planting field. I mean, when it says, and she planted a vineyard, I'm like, okay, this is not real. A single woman or man cannot plant a vineyard. That's, if you know petrology and the hill country, you know that that's completely feasible. So she's the any woman, or she's the any man, or the any Israelite, right? And that's, if you want to talk about the most radical philosophical claim of the Hebrew Bible, that might be the one, that it's all available to everybody. Okay, I'm going to stop there and let it go. Any questions?
Let me just ask one clarifying question thing. So you said something briefly about the 3 buckets. I don't think you closed the loop on how that relates. Would you classify these 5 civilizations intersect with those 3 buckets somehow?
Yeah.
And the philosophical would be the Israel, Rome, Greece, and the scholarly speculative would be Western. Is that what it was supposed to be?
Yes, and I'm going to put a note on every talk I give him now, like, close the loop at the end. He's caught me twice now, not closing the loop. Yeah, so I want to say speculative, Egypt and Mesopotamia is definitely doing some speculative stuff, which we'll talk about in the next class.
Abstract, but not.
Something going on there. It's tricky because it's some weird stuff going on there, or at least for the way we think of the world speculatively. But what I see as the major shift is advocating a particular way to reason abstractly. And that there's a better, I won't say right and wrong, but there are better and worse ways, and here's the way that they're being advocated. So if you're in Hebrew Bible, like anytime you're hitting Lama'an to dots, in order that you might know, just look at what happened right before that, and it's going to be a ritual. If you want a really easy one, Genesis 15, how can I know that you're going to give me the land, right? And again, best answer to a question ever. Try it with a student sometime. Bring me a heifer, a goat, a ram, and 2 pigeons, right? And then so how am I going to know? The only way you can know this thing is if you do a covenant cutting ceremony. They participated, even if he's sidelined in it, he is participating in it. And just notice the language of Yahweh in that scene. Knowingly you shall know. Right? The question was, how can I know? And the answer from Yahweh, as he's covenant with them, is knowingly you shall know. That becomes kind of a paradigm for philosophizing writ large. Even into the New Testament, right? Thinking about how epistemological the sacraments are for Jesus, right? Take, eat. By the way, it's the same verbs there from the Septuagint of Genesis 3, 6, 7, 7. And they took, and she took, she ate, and she gave. The rapid succession of verbs there. It's reversed by Jesus. Take and eat, in order that you might zakar, remember. Right? And remember means to cognitively integrate. So I think my suspicion is that's why the ancient Near Eastern people pushed the Hebrew Bible up over with the Greeks.
Yeah, so because when you said, you were going through it quickly for time's sake, when you said Rome, Israel, and Greece go together, you weren't necessarily making a genetic argument.
Yes, no,
You were
that's
making
correct.
a categorization, just to be
Yes,
clear,
yeah,
that
that's
they are
good.
engaged in a philosophical abstraction
Yes.
and epistemology that's self-aware in a way that's greater.
Yeah, and this is a hot topic in philosophy today. There's these, there's New York Times op-eds now being written like, if philosophy departments in America aren't going to actually do world philosophy, then let's just call them what they are, European philosophy. Like, so it shouldn't be a philosophy department, it should be the Department of European and European genetically linked philosophy, right? So there's my friends who work in Indian philosophy and Chinese philosophy and African philosophy. They're making the same claims. Like, you think that there's this, the name philosophy is Greek, right? But also analytic philosophers are also making the argument that no analytic philosopher today does the love of wisdom. That's not part of the enterprise anymore. That left 100 years ago. They're doing rhetoric and argumentation. That's all they're doing. As somebody who did a degree in a top 10 institution, I always say it says philosophy, but it was actually a rhetoric degree. Unfortunately.
Because of this feedback. So on this chart, you talked about historicist, and then you posited the idea of creation.
Yes.
So this is just feedback from my point of view. The word historicist for me would have negative. I think of historical criticism.
Yeah.
Historical critical approach. When I think of creationist, I don't really think of the creation side.
Maybe because I did a fellowship last year at the Creation Project,
Yeah.
so I was like, I don't know how to say this politely. I got lots of emails from people who were really, really interested in creation science more than I was. So maybe I was.
Well, I'm very big on this because a lot of people in philosophy talk about natural law.
Sure.
I would prefer to talk. The doctrine of creation is so fundamental to the Bible.
Yeah.
But I agree with the historicist, I think. Church the wrong script.
Yes, yeah.
I'm not sure the creationist.
Creational realist.
Well, I don't know if creation is the correct solution. I'm just
Creational
saying.
realist, I like that.
Yeah,
Is he
that's
like covenantal?
I went to covenant
that's
seminary. I can't use the word covenant in anything anymore. You just killed it for me. It's like eating M&Ms for 14 days. They were good the first 13 days. Something happened.
Dominic?
Yes. Dr. Johnson, this was great. Thank you very much. I was
Yes.
hesitant to ask you a question now, being that we'll have you in the Old Testament colloquium. Go to the Old Testament colloquium if you're interested. But I wanted to ask this. I think it's important. You mentioned the intellectual sophistication of ancient Israel and how some of your Assyriologist friends would say that they were just far above and beyond what we see in, for example, ancient Mesopotamia. But I would say at a synchronic level, reading the documents together, that seems to be very obvious as a biblicist.
Yes.
Diachronically, though, the issue that we're running into is that many of these Assyriologists would assume that they would deal with
Oh,
where they would work from a critical perspective. And ultimately, this maturity, let's say this intellectual maturity, came to pass in the post-exilic period, or the Neo-Babylonian exilic period,
yes.
when you would expect such intellectual
You're
sophistication.
hitting the
among
axial age
these-
problem.
What's
Yeah.
that?
You're hitting the axial age solution problem. whatever.
You're making me sound smarter than I am.
Okay,
but
yeah.
I'm just saying. I want to know how you work through that, because as
So-
we read these texts next to each other, yes,
Yeah.
but we would expect that if these texts were written in the 5th century or the 4th century. Before
That's a really good point. So a quick story, sitting in a room with, an Assyriologist, an Egyptologist, and a poser Hebrew Bible person walking through the bar. And sitting in the room, and so I'm a Hebrew Bible guy, but I like historical criticism. I think there's serious problems all the way through that whole project of the documentary hypothesis. And I hope most of you would agree with me to some level. And I'm sitting in a room where the other two Hebrew Bible people were like, they're German and Danish. That's like what they do for a living, is they slice and dice the Bible, right? And by sources and times. And having the Egyptologist and the Assyriologist kind of look across the room and they go, now, and they were genuinely perplexed, like, now explain this documentary stuff to us again, because they don't have it, right? They don't have this problem at all.
Yeah.
And I said, actually, I don't work in that field, so I'm just going to take it away, boys. And watching these two grown men just kind of like try and describe it, and it's actually Mark Vandenbroek and Jan Aspen, who almost said the identical words in the room. They said, like, how is that not circular reasoning? And then they were drilling these guys against a wall. It was, I like these guys, but there was a small pleasure in my heart. Yeah, so I think actually my experience with the dozen or so A&E people I've worked with, they're not as convinced about the late age hypothesis. And I think, as you know, there's people who are pushing, there's good scholars, Hebrew Bible scholars, who are pushing back to 10th century dates, that at least there's some core going back to 10th century. So if I really wanted to, I could say, forget about all the final form and that stuff. Let's just talk about the core. And trust me, whatever's going on in that core, I got enough there to show you that something's going on. And I would suppose that, yeah, the Orientalists at the University of Chicago, they're definitely thinking late date. Of course, they're probably tapping, there's probably some exchange of ideas along the coast there, and the Hellenistic period, and that's forming as well. But I think that might be on a change, maybe. I should put at least a footnote in here about this, yeah.
I think, particularly when it comes to wisdom literature, critical scholars would say, and you mentioned wisdom literature, critical scholars would they date almost all wisdom literature very, very late, particularly Ecclesiastes, many into the Greco-Roman period, and then, Proverbs, the final form, into much later. So I just think it's important to think through.
Fortunately, most of this doesn't rely at all on wisdom literature. Although I would see wisdom literature comporting with everything that I'm saying, but I can make all of this case from, give me Genesis and Exodus, and I'm done. And it's a strong case, I think. But yeah, I think you're exactly right, and I need to take this head on, because you can definitely not be the last person to raise this issue.
Paul Anton de Lagarde, the father of modern Septuagint studies, was an Orientalist at the University of Göttingen from 1869 to 1891.
That was not the end of that statement.
A subtle advertisement for Septuagint studies. You have to begin by being an Orientalist.
Yes, okay. I'm thinking of cheerleading. Perfect example of pointless.
Thanks, Dr. Johnson. The idea of wisdom is every man's endeavor. I was wondering, maybe you talked about this. But how do you square that away with the actual subversion of the elite man's endeavor? What you see in Hannah's song.
Oh yeah.
The undoing of the wise man's wisdom.
Right.
Yeah, and actually wisdom is that actually at the sort of earthly level. How does that work in your control?
I must be misunderstanding you, because everything you just said sounds like it reinforces my point.
Sure. Well, like wisdom actually belongs.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, like you have these reversals of.
Yeah, I think there's
the bear and
something
woman shovel.
proto-Socratic about it. Like this, the people who think, this is the same in Ecclesiastes. The the one who thinks he knows, right? And that there's something that has to be corrected there. So it's not like they are the wise and the elites. That's the problem in the system. That there are people who think they are. Like, and the same thing with political rulership, right? The bows of the mighty are broken. The haughty are brought down. So it's a corruption in the system that we dealt with.
Because I think in the same, in First Samuel 2, I think it says, for Yahweh is a God of knowledge.
Yeah,
It destroys all these people who would think they have knowledge.
Well, I think you get a very similar. I always put Paul in the kind of wisdom literature category. You get a very similar even 1 Corinthians 1 and 2. Right? Like their philosophy, like kind of this, like the general argument that every academic makes is you're doing this whether you like it or not. The question is whether you're doing it well or poorly. And these seem to indicate there have been systems, traditions that have been built up that are doing it poorly or wrongly or overreaching or domesticating. Ecclesiastes, which again, historic criticism is a problematic text to lean on, but it seems to be a big, massive takedown. So I'm not as convinced that it's a Hellenistic takedown.
All right, time just for one more question. Okay, so I'll just ask the last one then. Still curious about these buckets. I'm not sure I like those terms. When you talk about it.
Yeah.
I just wonder if they don't distinguish clearly enough.
The terms or the description?
The terms,
Okay.
yeah. But the ethical, how would this slice across that? Because as you know, my understanding is
Dabble in ethics.
yeah, a little bit. That the philosophical tradition is at its height because it's focused when it's focused on ethical transformation. That's what it's really about. Curious what I don't know the A&E literature well enough to know. Is there in these other two, we'll just say academic or speculative buckets, or Mesopotamian and Egyptian, is that include an ethical element in the way that the Greek and Roman tradition does, or not?
So that's the part, that's the reason why I hedged. So if you think of ethical as advocating a way into it, that's the ethics of it.
Well, not just advocating the epistemological stance, but actually a way of inhabiting.
Yes, a way of inhabiting so that you see, which is ultimately. So ethics is, I subsume epistemology under ethics. John framed those, I think it's what's going on in Scripture.
And they don't have that.
Well, it's tricky. So you would say in the scribal tradition, where you have the kind of really super smart people, you have these stories from the Greeks, ironically, about the Babylonians. That it's the elite scribes and nomenologists and diviners it's a father-son tradition. And actually, it's a Greek person saying, "Oh yeah, I wish we were more like the Babylonians, where it's father-son tradition, and so they could beat their student." Of all things. So there you go for ethics. But if you just look across the Mesopotamian literature for somebody saying, "Hey, do this in order to understand these things and to be this kind of person who can see the world in this kind of way," it's very difficult to find the text. We're dealing with what we have, and I think, as I said last night, with Egyptian literature, you're in the same position, but they estimate that we only have 10% of the Egyptian literature. I mean, there's this kind of joke in Egyptology, like if we discovered all the literature of Egypt, all of our theories might change. We might think Egypt is a completely different place. We're just kind of stuck with what was stuck.
Is it related to a divine emperor kind of idea? I mean, I know the Roman development's going to change a little bit, but in other words, is ethics in them, let's say Babylon, is ethics determined primarily by dictation of a divine type emperor as opposed to the Greek and Roman tradition? Is that part of the difference? I suppose that the ethics comes by what is a philosophical consideration. Is that too simplistic?
Yes. Let me. It's not too simplistic. Let me talk about what's going. It's in some ways like you're just not talking about the way that they seem to be thinking about things. So it's not even that there's no reflection of the good. Jeremiah Unterman, wrote the book Justice for All: How the Jewish Bible Revolutionized Ethics. It's great. He's the one who pointed this out to me. He's Jacob Milgram was his PhD supervisor, the Leviticus guy. And he pointed out, like, look at in Mesopotamia, and you get this all over the place, but Mesopotamia and Egypt was particularly strong. The gods don't talk to humans. They don't give any. He sees Sinai as the revolutionary event because you have a God who personally coaches his people. And the Mesopotamians, they're running around like chickens with their heads cut off because they don't know what they did to anger which God. So you have all of these laments like, oh God, just help me understand which one of you is mad, and I will give oblations, right? And friends coming along like Jovian friends, kind of saying, just give oblations to all the gods, cover your bases, right? I mean, and even in Athens, when Paul gets there, there's the God of ignorance, right? Which seems to be a cover your bases kind of God. And he just says that cacophony, and gods are no better than humans. They're getting drunk and having sex with things and people and animals and making a mess and killing things and going to war. And in that situation, there is no repentance and forgiveness. There's like not even the possibility of repentance and forgiveness because that's all contingent on a system where you know what you've done wrong, you know what you violated, and you know there's a path to reconcile. And so in a culture, in a cult, in a theology where that's entirely absent and the opposite is true, there is no way that you're supposed to behave. It really is and you do have, I mean, Hammurabi's code seems to be trying to take a stab at giving some sense of equity and justice, but even there, it's not fully getting there. And then there's the question last night I talked about that nobody seems to have known about Hammurabi's code when it's around. Nobody ever references it. It's a mute document in the ancient Near East. So yeah, it's really difficult. I think the laments is the only place where you get these people. And what are the laments? I don't know how to behave. I don't know what to do to please. And now turn to the Psalms and turn to Sinai. You see the exact opposite. Because you didn't become the kind of justice that I wanted you to be in the world. Because you didn't become those kind of people, and you knew it. And I gave you very clear what you should be and what you absolutely must avoid. And you did the very thing I told you not to.
Okay, well, this has been very stimulating. Great way to start off this fall semester club. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And we hope to see you every week. And to be here for offset students. Again, Dr. Greg Allison will be with us next week. I'm not sure what we talked about.
Mere ecclesiology.
Oh, good. Great.
Yep.
And feel free to email me with any further thoughts.
Yeah, good. And again, we hope to see you tomorrow, 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. at the reception.
6 at that point.